From 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany set up over 44,000 concentration camps for a wide range of purposes, including forced labor and detention of people thought to be enemies of the Third Reich. Near the end of the war, as Germany's military force collapsed before the eyes of the Führer, the Allied troops began to close in on the camps, with the Soviets approaching from the east and the British, French, and Americans from the west. Consequently, Hitler and his second-in-command gave SS Generalleutnant Gottlob Berger, one of their most trusted allies, the power to decide what to do with the prisoners. In what became known as the Long March of 1945, thousands of prisoners of war walked hundreds of miles in harsh weather conditions across European countries to reach Germany before the Allies could free them. Almighty Gottlob. Gottlob Christian Berger was born into a sizable upper-middle-class family in the Weimar Republic of Germany in 1896. He first fought for the German army in World War I, where he ranked up to lieutenant and won an Iron Cross First Class for his services. In the 1920s, Berger officially joined the Nazi Party. As the Third Reich became more powerful throughout the following decade, he worked in several positions inside the army, until he was appointed the head of the recruiting office at the Schutzstaffel main office in 1938. During his years as an SS recruiter, Berger convinced thousands of men to sign up to fight in the name of the Nazis, and his skills helped the Waffen-SS become one of the most essential branches of the German army. Berger was known as an ardent anti-Semite, a cynical yet competent officer, and one of the most ruthless wartime lieutenants. According to historian Gerhard Rempel, he was also a skilled manipulator. Many of Bergen's recruiting and leadership tactics were not embraced by fellow Nazis, including Heinrich Himmler. One of the leading architects of the Holocaust, Himmler complained that he would often be distracted by rumblings about Berger from other SS leaders, one of whom said that the recruiter was, quote, unscrupulous, blunt, and inelegant in manner and expression, yet also full of genial loquacity and racy humor. Berger was part of Hitler's 12 apostles, the most influential men within the Nazi Party, and was considered almost a deity among fellow soldiers, who nicknamed him Der Allmächtige Gottlob, the Almighty Gottlob, a wordplay on Gott, the German word for God. Although Berger helped the Reich accomplish several macabre projects and warfare strategies, he continued to work as a recruiter throughout the war. No more time. On July 19, 1944, as his empire began to crumble in front of him, Adolf Hitler issued an executive order from his Wolfschanze headquarters concerning preparations for the defense of the decaying Third Reich. The instructions put the German population on a permanent war footing, and orders came to begin planning the evacuation of slave laborers and concentration camp prisoners to keep the advancing Soviet army from freeing them. During these later stages of the war, many prisoners of war were afraid when they heard rumors of evacuation. Several conflicting stories suggested that they would be either used as hostages to leverage their escape or forced to march until exhaustion. Only a day after Hitler's orders, on July 20th, 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg and other conspirators attempted to take the life of the Führer as part of Operation Valkyrie. Knowing that his empire was quickly falling, Hitler turned to Himmler and asked him to lead the replacement army and choose someone to handle the German prisoner of war camps, which were also known as Stalags, as an abbreviation for Stammlager. Despite his dislike for the conniving Berger, Himmler chose him for the task. He knew the recruiter was entirely dedicated to the Third Reich, especially as he was one of the main proponents of the final solution, a Nazi policy of complete extermination of Jews and all other concentration camp prisoners. In addition to the Soviet army's advance from the east, the British, French, and Americans were approaching from the west by early 1945. There was no time to plan a thorough evacuation. Berger had to decide what to do. The leader eventually determined not to let the Allies liberate the prisoners and ordered German officers to move them out of the concentration camps in occupied Poland, near the front lines, and take them to Germany by foot amidst the freezing early spring weather. The Long March. Although the treks began sporadically in July of 1944, the bulk of the journey to reach Germany started in March of 1945. It became known as the Long March. With every day that passed, the number of fleeing prisoners increased. In total, over 120,000 Allied prisoners of war were on the move. Each Stalag was responsible for its own marches coordination via different routes. Although the average walking distance was 500 miles, some men marched up to 1,000, as the paths were not always consistent, and individual groups sometimes traveled in circles or zigzagged. The prisoners were divided into groups of up to 300 men formed in small columns. They marched together through frozen rivers, muddy fields, and chilled winds of up to 25 miles per day, only to barely rest in empty churches, barns, factories, or even in the open. Meanwhile, thousands of German civilian refugees, mostly women, young children, and other foreigners, also attempted to reach the west and followed the trails left by the prisoners of war. The 1945 winter was one of the coldest recorded in the 20th century, with blizzards and temperatures of -15 degrees Fahrenheit, which continued well into the springtime. The prisoners were not wearing appropriate clothing for these conditions, and they also suffered from extreme hunger. Many scavenged to survive with only rations of food available, and ate dogs, cats, or even grass. The unsanitary conditions and near starvation caused hundreds of POWs to suffer from exhaustion, typhus, pneumonia, diphtheria, pellagra, frostbite, and other diseases. In addition, the prisoners, Nazi guards, and civilians were always in danger of an airstrike by the Allied forces, which often mistook the columns of advancing people for retreating German troops. The scattered marches would experience different conditions. Sometimes Germans from small towns would provide them with wagons for their ill or share their rations. However, most of the time, the locals would throw objects at the passers-by. As the ice and snow began to melt, many of the columns of prisoners finally began to reach the western side of Germany. Some ran into the advancing Allied armies and were liberated without question. But others did not encounter friendly troops and met a terrible fate, as Nazis used the prisoners of war as human shields and hostages in the Baltic Sea. In early May, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command implemented Operation Exodus and began the process to repatriate the prisoners by air. Over the next month, the command flew almost 3,000 sorties, carrying 72,500 prisoners of war back home. Aftermath. After Germany fell to the Allies, Gottlob Berger was arrested and put on trial in 1947. Berger's indictment read, quote, "Between September 1944 and May 1945, hundreds of thousands of American and Allied prisoners of war were compelled to undertake forced marches in severe weather without adequate rest, shelter, food, clothing, and medical supplies, and that such forced marches, conducted under the authority of the defendant Berger, chief of prisoner of war affairs, resulted in great privation and deaths to many thousands of prisoners." Berger argued that under the 1929 Geneva Convention, the Germans had the duty to remove prisoners of war from a potential war zone. The Generalleutnant also claimed that the rapid advance of the Red and Allied armies left the Nazis no choice but to force them to march in such perilous conditions instead of by train. Berger ultimately attempted to appeal to the judge by stating that he had protested against Hitler's decision. According to him, he had neither the power nor the authority to countermand the executive order. His statements and insufficient eyewitness evidence earned him an acquittal, but 2 years later, he was convicted for his role in the genocide of European Jews and sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, his stay was reduced, and the almighty Gottlob was released in 1951. After his release, Berger returned to his native Baden-Württemberg, where he lived an ordinary life as the owner of a curtain rail factory and as the patriarch of a large family. For the remainder of his life, he continued to defend his right-wing beliefs, contributing to monthly journals and magazines, and writing articles encouraging the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to provide further consideration to former members of his beloved SS. The Long March period ultimately became lost within the broader account of the last months of World War II, as chaos ruled the Nazi Party. With the camp shut down, the bureaucracy gone, all top officials in hiding, and countless individual events occurring simultaneously, this atrocious event became buried and widely unknown. Still, the Long March period is an emblem of the twilight era of the Third Reich and how it faced its demise in violence, fire, and blood. Thank you for watching our Dark Ducks video. Please let us know if you have any historical topics that you'd like us to cover. And don't forget to subscribe to this and our other 7 channels, and hit the bell icon to be notified of all our newest content.